Hey guys, tonight we step into Victorian Britain where the street lamps glow soft and yellow, carriages rattle over cobblestones, and everything looks elegant from a distance. As long as you do not look too closely at the people, society quietly shuts away. You drift above the rooftops like a sleepy little ghost, watching chimney smoke curl into the night and listening to the city murmur under a sky with no light pollution and absolutely zero Wi-Fi. Somewhere out there, a version of you in a corset or a stiff collar is trying not to be considered odd. Honestly, you probably will not survive this world for long if you say what you really think. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want to play along, drop your city and your local time in the comments so we can imagine this strange old world together from 100 different bedrooms. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hover closer to the streets and step down into the body of an ordinary passerby, boots on stone, breath fogging in the cool air. The year sits somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. Around you, the city is busy building railways, factories, and a proper sense of importance. You pass posters bragging about progress, steam engines, and science like it is one long Victorian tech conference. People talk about electricity as if it is magic waiting just around the corner. Yet just beneath that confident surface you feel a different current, a quiet fear of minds that do not behave. The word madness hangs heavy in conversations, usually whispered. You hear it in parlor where gaslight flickers on wallpaper, in pubs where men nurse dark beer, and in cramped tenements where families count their coins. Almost everyone knows someone who is not quite right or who has gone away for their nerves, but they rarely use plain words. You stroll past a respectable townhouse and imagine the family inside. If one of their sons starts raving or a daughter sinks into despair and refuses to eat, they face more than heartbreak. They face disgrace. In this world, your reputation is like your social passport. Lose it and doors slam shut. A relative with odd behavior is not seen as a person who needs help. They are a threat to the family name and its chance at good marriages and decent work. It is like having a glitchy app on your phone, except the fix might be locking the phone in a drawer forever. As you walk, you notice how often people talk about self-control. You're supposed to master your feelings, keep passion in check, and maintain a calm, rational mind. Any crack in that calm becomes scary. If you cry too much, talk too fast, laugh too loudly, or sink into silence for too long, someone might start to wonder. These are not just bad days. In Victorian eyes, they might be the first step down a slope that ends with a locked door. In this world, asylums begin to appear as answers to a growing problem. You turn a corner and see one on a hill outside the town, its long brick wings stretching out like careful arms. By the mid-9th century, laws require many counties to build such institutions, promising that people with mental distress will receive proper care, instead of ending up in filthy private madhouses or rotting in prisons. On paper, it sounds humane, almost modern, a place with doctors, clean beds, fresh air, and moral treatment where gentle, routine and kind supervision supposedly guide minds back to health. You pause and take in the building. The windows are tall but barred. The grounds are spacious with lawns and trees, yet everything is enclosed. From a distance, it looks like a grand country house or a proud new school. Up close, you feel the subtle chill of separation. This is where society puts people it finds difficult, frightening, or embarrassing, locked away. They will not disturb polite dinner parties or offend the neighbors. Historians still argue whether these asylums grow mainly from compassion or from a need to control anyone who does not fit the approved pattern. A carriage rattles past you toward the main gate. Inside, you glimpse someone clutching a small bundle of belongings flanked by family members who all look tired. You watch their faces and feel how complex this moment is. There may be love here and relief, and shame and fear all scrambled together. Some relatives truly hope this place will help. Others simply want the disturbing behavior out of the house. You can almost hear the conversations that led to this day, spoken in rooms where curtains were drawn for privacy. You stand to one side as the gate swings open. The guards and attendants at the entrance check papers and nod with professional distance. For them, this is routine. Another name in a ledger, another body in a bed. The patient might have raged wildly or simply refused to speak or perhaps quoted poetry at inappropriate times. The range of unacceptable is broad here. It is a bit like modern social media comments. Step outside the unspoken rules and people move fast to mute or block you, except this version involves real keys and heavy locks. Nearby, a group of curious locals linger on the road, pretending to admire the view while sneaking glances at the new arrival. Victorians can be strangely fascinated by insanity. Some even treat asylums as tourist sites. There are stories of visitors paying a small fee to stroll through the corridors on special days and look at the patients as if they were part of an odd museum. You picture someone licking ice cream while staring at a woman in deep despair and feel your stomach twist. Progress and cruelty can sit very comfortably at the same table. You leave the hill and let your attention drift back into the city, noticing how often the asylum is used as a threat in everyday talk. Parents warn disobedient children that they will be sent away if they keep misbehaving. Husbands jokingly tell wives and wives tell husbands that one more outburst will earn them a nice quiet room somewhere with padded walls. It is half a joke and half a warning. You might grin politely, but you also file the possibility away in a frightened corner of your mind. In the newspapers you glance at, insanity is both a moral lesson and a spectacle. Articles wring their hands about drinking, factory stress, city crowds, and modern temptations that supposedly overload the brain. One writer blames novels for driving people to delusion, which is mildly ironic considering they have never had to doom-scroll a comment section. Another insists that life in the countryside with its fresh air and honest labor protects the mind, as if anxiety politely avoids fields and sheep. What you do not see much of is empathy. The insane are more often talked about than listened to. You walk through all this with your modern awareness, noticing how fragile safety feels. You keep your voice level, your expression composed, your gestures restrained. If your moods swing or your thoughts race, you tuck that away where no one can see it. In a culture that prizes self-control and public respectability, the line between being eccentric and being locked up is thin and blurry. You sense deep in your chest that people are less afraid of madness itself and more afraid of what it reveals about the body, the brain, and the limits of willpower. It is night again now. The lamps glow, the asylums loom at the edges of town, and families sit behind closed doors, hoping their minds stay within acceptable limits. You stand quietly in the street, listening to the clatter of hooves and the low hum of conversation, aware that behind this polished surface lies a system ready to hide away anyone who makes society uncomfortable. Under the tidy veneer of Victorian order, the foundations of a house of misery are being laid to you brick by brick in the name of science, morality, and peace of mind. You leave the polished city streets and drift backward through time just a little to step into one of the older private madhouses that sit in shabby corners behind high brick walls. You walk up a narrow lane that smells of damp straw and coal smoke, and the building that rises in front of you looks less like a hospital and more like a grumpy boarding house that has given up on fresh paint. The sign above the door is polite and vague, promising care and quiet, which is Victorian for do not ask too many questions. Inside you move through dark corridors lit by weak candles and grimy windows. This is the world that existed before big county asylums took over. Families with enough money pay the proprietor to take in troublesome relatives, and the arrangement depends almost entirely on trust and reputation. There is no real system of inspection. Here, no modern idea of patient rights, just a private agreement and a locked door. One very real historical fact is that in the 18th and early 19th century, These madhouses operate as businesses with owners who profit from each long-term patient they can keep inside. It is not exactly the kind of place you would swipe right on if you were looking for compassionate care. You look into a room where several people sit on benches dressed in worn clothing that might once have belonged to someone richer. The smell of sweat and unwashed fabric hangs in the air. The staff seem hurried, practical, sometimes rough. Some patients mutter, some stare, some try to talk to you even though you're ghosting through the scene. You notice how easy it would be for quiet neglect to blend into outright abuse. If a patient does not have a powerful family checking in regularly, who will speak up for them? Historians still argue whether these early matters are mostly cruel cages or whether a few of them, in spite of everything, genuinely try to provide shelter in a society that offers almost nothing else. In another locked chamber, you encounter something even stranger. A wheel-like cage sits in the center, designed to spin a person around in the air, an experimental treatment meant to rearrange the mind through dizzying motion. You might call it a nightmare carnival ride without the fun music and bright lights. Reports from the period describe devices like this along with cold plunge baths and sudden shocks as serious medical interventions. It is one of those moments when you realize that cutting edge can age very badly. If you have ever tried spinning in a desk chair to fix your mood, you can imagine how successful this probably is. You step away from the madhouse and let time move forward again. A new kind of institution is taking shape. Reformers and doctors talk about something called moral treatment, a phrase that sounds a bit smug but also carries real hope. You find yourself standing on the grounds of a quieter place in the countryside, a retreat where the approach to mental distress is gentler. One influential example in real history is a Quaker institution that emphasizes kindness, routine, and respect, arguing that calm surroundings and humane behavior can soothe chaotic minds. Patients here take walks, tend gardens, and share meals at tables instead of being chained in filthy cells. The air feels different in this setting. You hear birds instead of constant clanging doors. Rooms have windows that actually open. Restraint is still used but meant to be limited, not the default. You watch a patient pacing nervously, and an attendant speaks with them softly rather than shouting. For a moment, you feel your shoulders relax. It is easy to see why people talk excitedly about this new philosophy. Instead of treating insanity as a permanent curse or a crime, moral treatment suggests that minds can recover with the right environment, structure, and care. It is the early Victorian version of switching from rage-filled comments to a calm, moderated community, at least in theory, but spreads. Politicians, doctors, and middle-class citizens are impressed by stories of gentle cures and neatly ordered retreats. They begin to imagine a network of public asylums inspired by this model, places where the poor as well as the wealthy might receive civilized treatment. You watch debates in wood-paneled meeting rooms where men in black coats argue about costs, local responsibility, and the danger of leaving insane people in workhouses or prisons, as some major piece of legislation appears telling counties to provide asylums for their residents, and the idea feels bold and forward-looking. You can almost hear the self-congratulatory speeches forming themselves. Yet, as new county asylums rise, bigger and more imposing than the modest retreats that inspired them, something begins to shift. You walk through the construction site of one such building, watching walls climb higher under the blows of hammers. Architects talk about light, air, and symmetry, proudly explaining how the layout will calm excitable minds. Administrators plan for strict routines, early rising, meals at set times, supervised walks, quiet evenings. All of this is framed as scientific and moral at once, an ideal blend of discipline and compassion. It sounds a bit like those productivity apps that swear they will fix your life if you just schedule every minute. Inside the finished asylum, you follow a doctor on his rounds. He carries himself with professional authority, taking notes on patients who are encouraged to obey, work, and behave as rationally as possible. The aim is not only to relieve suffering, but to restore people to the roles expected of them in society. If you are a laborer, you are meant to become a steady worker again. If you are a wife or daughter, you're supposed to return to your domestic duties with quiet cheer. A mind that does not fit into these patterns is described as disordered, which is a polite way of saying that the person is not cooperating with the script. Out in the asylum gardens, you observe patients, weeding paths, tending vegetables, and pushing wheelbarrows. The work is called therapeutic, which it can be, especially compared with chains and dark cells. At the same time, you notice how useful this labor is for the institution itself. The asylum saves money on staff and supplies when patients grow their own food and maintain the grounds. You stand by a laundry building where women scrub, clothing in hot soapy water, arms red and raw. It is hard not to see the practical advantage for managers who are trying to keep costs down, and maybe harder not to imagine a Victorian spreadsheet quietly smiling. Among all this, a curious detail catches your eye. On certain days, visitors are allowed to tour the facility, strolling along selected corridors like respectful tourists. Staff guide them to the quietest, neatest wards where compliant patients sit calmly and the air smells of polish instead of sweat. One newspaper report from the air mentions outings where people treat these visits almost like trips to a museum or a zoo, discussing the architecture and the interesting cases. You watch a couple comment on how restful it seems, then leave to enjoy tea and cake, never seeing the less presentable corners. It is a small but telling quirk that shows how easily suffering can be turned into a spectacle when wrapped in respectable surroundings. As you wander back toward the main gate, you let all these impressions settle into a single uneasy picture. The old madhouses, with their private profiteering and hidden abuses, are giving way to larger institutions built on ideals of moral treatment, reform, and scientific observation. There is a real shift here, a step away from open chains and filthy cells toward order, routine, and at least a language of kindness. Yet power lies firmly with doctors, managers, and distant authorities, not with the people locked inside. Promises of cure and humanity sit side by side with economic pressures and social expectations, quietly shaping how these new houses of care will actually feel once the gates close behind each arriving carriage. You step into a high-ceiling committee room in London, where the air smells of ink, pipe smoke, and self-importance. Chairs scrape on polished floors as officials in dark suits sit around a long table covered with papers. You float behind them, reading upside down the titles on the documents. Words like lunacy, reform, and regulation appear again and again, dressed up in tidy handwriting that looks calmer than the reality it is about to shape. One man clears his throat and begins to speak about numbers. You hear how many people have been certified as insane in the past year, how many beds the new asylums provide, how much money counties are spending on bricks, food, staff, and fuel. A very real historical fact here is that by the middle of the 19th century, laws in England and Wales standardize asylum building and inspection with a central board of commissioners in lunacy keeping watch over what local authorities are DOI. In theory, that board is like a serious version of a customer review site. In practice, it has very limited stars to hand out. You follow a commissioner as he travels by train to inspect a provincial asylum. The countryside slides by green fields and smoke from factory chimneys sharing the same horizon. He carries a notebook, a watch, and a quiet belief that good rules will produce good care. When he arrives, the superintendent greets him with careful politeness, knowing that this visit can affect funding, reputation, and local pride. You notice how much of the conversation focuses on figures, not feelings. How many patients, how many staff, how much space, how many deaths, all arranged in neat columns that almost disguise the human stories behind them. Walking the corridors, the inspector counts heads and looks at registers. He checks that certificates are in order, that 2 doctors have signed off on each admission, that legal rules about confinement are technically followed. On paper, everything appears satisfactory. Patients are listed with diagnoses that sound firm even when they rest on vague impressions or moral judgments. Historians still argue whether these inspections mainly protect vulnerable patients or mainly reassure taxpayers that their money is not being wasted. You sense that the truth bends in both directions at once, like an awkward yoga pose nobody really enjoys. You drift into the office where the asylum superintendent keeps his records. On his desk lie plans for expansion. When the institution opened, it was designed for a modest number of patients, a few hundred at most, with an expectation that many would recover and leave. That was the dream. Reality looks different. Admissions keep rising. People with chronic conditions rarely go home. Families learn that the asylum can function as long-term storage for relatives who cannot work or fit. NTO crowded households. Local officials quietly encourage this because placing a difficult person in an asylum solves a social problem that might otherwise spill into the streets. Numbers creep up, year by year. Wards built for 20 beds now hold 30. Narrow iron beds sit close, together with barely room to move between them. A mainstream fact that many historians point out is that Victorian asylums across Britain become steadily more overcrowded from the mid-century onward, with patient populations doubling or even tripling their original capacity in some places. You stand in a dormitory at night, listening to dozens of people breathing, muttering, and shifting under thin blankets, and you understand how quickly any ideal of personal attention dissolves in the sheer weight of bodies outside this one institution. You follow the flow of money that feeds or starves it. Counties pay for their asylums through local taxes, and nobody wants those taxes to rise. In a meeting of a county council, you hear landowners and businessmen arguing about rates with more intensity than they show about suffering. Every extra nurse or attendant is a line on a budget. Every repair to a roof or improvement in food costs something when they choose between spending on roads, schools, and asylums. It is not hard to predict which will feel more popular. This is the Victorian version of trying to fund essential services while pretending a wallet is bottomless. Back inside the asylum, you notice the consequences of penny pinching. Staff numbers remain low while patient numbers soar. One nurse moves briskly through a ward, changing bandages, soothing someone in tears, scolding another who has soiled himself, all in the space of a few minutes. She is doing the work of 2 or 3 people, and her patience wears thin. A tired attendant snaps at a confused old man who wanders too close. It is not that everyone here is cruel. It is that everyone is exhausted. You can feel how quickly exhaustion turns into indifference and how indifference turns into roughness that nobody has time to question. Records in the superintendent's office show an interesting pattern. When inspectors announce surprise visits, cleaning increases, meals improve, and staff straighten themselves like actors before an opening night. When the inspection is over, standards quietly slide again. There are stories of some institutions hiring extra temporary staff only during inspection periods to make the ratios look better. A quirky little strategy that would fit nicely in a handbook of creative accounting. Official reports speak of generally satisfactory conditions, while letters from some patients and families describe neglect, boredom, and casual cruelty hidden in the spaces between scheduled rounds. You wander past the laundry, where a thin girl scrubs at stained shirts until her hands are raw, then into a kitchen where watery soup bubbles in huge metal pots. All of this is logged in ledgers as food, clothing, and occupation provided. On paper, the asylum is doing its job. Yet, here you are watching men and women eat meals that barely fill them and sleep in wards that never truly quiet down. The constant noise, smells, and lack of privacy grind at the mind in slow, invisible ways. You start to realize that misery can grow not only from overt abuse but from endless low-level discomfort piled up over time. In another room, the medical superintendent carefully enters diagnosis into his case book. New categories appear as 19th century psychiatry tries to classify every twitch and mood. Terms like moral insanity and melancholia sit next to epileptic insanity, and senile dementia. Some labels reflect genuine attempts to understand brain disorders. Others blend moral judgment with medical language, turning disappro. Ved behavior into official pathology. Historians still argue whether the growth of these diagnostic systems represents real scientific progress or simply a more refined way to enforce social norms under the cover of expert authority. You step into the small office where letters to and from patients are collected. Some are never delivered. Staff quietly set aside notes that might upset families or embarrass the institution. Complaints, desperate pleas, and accusations sometimes vanish into locked drawers. External oversight exists, but it is limited by distance, time, and the willingness of insiders to reveal their own problems. Every system that monitors itself is tempted to flinch away from its own flaws. That temptation is very much alive here, hiding behind formal language and stamped seals. In a corner, you find a locked cupboard with an odd assortment of objects, musical instruments for the band that plays on special occasions, costumes for patient entertainments, and a box of printed programs from asylum dances and concerts. These events serve to impress visitors and dignitaries, showing off a cheerful image of institutional life. Patients who behave well enough to perform are praised as examples of moral and mental improvement. Those who cannot participate remain out of sight. You feel the strangeness of a world where a polished performance in a hall can overshadow the daily reality in crowded wards. As you walk back through the main corridor, boots echoing on stone, you sense the gap between what reformers imagine and what the system actually produces. On paper, the asylum network looks tidy, inspected, and increasingly scientific. In lived experience, it feels crowded, underfunded, and shaped by local politics more than by compassion. Rules and regulations can reduce the worst extremes of abuse, but they cannot erase the human tendency to save face, save money, and prioritize reputation over relief. Within that gap, misery spreads quietly, filling every space that oversight, funding, and empathy fail to reach. You stand in a cramped Victorian parlor, watching the air feel heavier than the curtains. A nervous family sits around a table, eyes fixed on a folded document that glows in the lamplight like a small, dangerous spell. At the center of all this, there is you, inhabiting the body of the one being discussed. While everyone talks about your fate as if you are some awkward household object, nobody knows where to put on the paper lies the key to confinement. In much of 19th century Britain, committal to a public asylum usually requires 2 medical certificates and a magistrate's order, a neat-looking process that claims to protect against wrongful imprisonment. It sounds reassuring, almost formal, enough to trust. Then you watch how easily those signatures can slide from technical safeguard to rubber stamp. Doctors do not always examine carefully. Magistrates are busy and families arrive with strong opinions about what needs to happen. Rules look solid when printed, but they soften quickly under social pressure, like jelly left too close to the fire. Your attention drifts to the reasons that get written down in the official books. A clerk dips his pen and records phrases like domestic trouble, grief, religious excitement, in-parents, disappointed love. Whole lives shrink into a few dramatic words. A very real historical detail is that asylum case books often list supposed causes that range from childbirth and alcoholism to business failure and overwork of the mind. You realize that some of these causes sound like things people still experience on a regular Tuesday. The difference is that your time has group chats and memes, and this time has locked doors and certificates. You leave the parlor and step into a magistrate's office. Where a man with tired eyes listens to hurried explanations. A husband claims his wife has become unmanageable, talking too much, spending money, refusing duties. A son insists his elderly father keeps wandering and embarrassing the family in church. Poorer cases arrive via local authorities who simply want a troublesome person off the streets. There is rarely any neutral ground in these stories. Each narrative is shaped by whoever has the power to speak. Historians still argue whether these hearings represent genuine attempts at protection or whether they function largely as polite rituals to justify decisions already made at home. You sit in the mind of a woman who has begun to talk back to her husband, refusing to endure insults in silence. Her anger is sharp, her words quick. In a culture that prizes female meekness, this behavior is labeled hysterical and irrational. The doctor who examines her nods gravely when her husband describes her fits of temper. You notice that nobody asks why she is angry. The diagnosis flows from her disobedience rather than from any mysterious brain condition. It is a bit like banning a user from a forum, not because they broke the rules, but because they made the moderators uncomfortable. Next, you ride on a jolting cart beside a man who drinks himself into repeated collapses, public drunkenness, lost jobs, domestic chaos. They have all piled up. Authorities decide he needs confinement, not in a prison, but in an asylum. In many records, imperance appears again and again as a route to certification. The lines between criminality, addiction, and insanity blur until the categories feel interchangeable. If behavior disrupts work, family order, or public peace, it becomes fair game for medicalization. Somewhere, a theoretical psychiatrist is quietly high-fiving themselves for turning moral trouble into a billable condition in a poor DI. Strict. You follow a constable into a tiny lodging room where an elderly woman mutters prayers at the wall. She's thin, her clothes worn, her rent overdue. Neighbors complain about her shouting during the night. No one has money or time to support her. Poor lunatics like her, especially vulnerable because their families cannot cushion their oddities with private care. The asylum becomes the default solution for minds that embarrass the parish and cost more to watch over than anyone wants to pay. Care in these situations feels less like compassion and more like a budget line. Some cases are truly dramatic. You stand in a crowded street as a man climbs a statue and begins proclaiming himself a prophet, predicting doom for the empire. Crowd gathers, half amused and half alarmed. Police coax him down and lead him away, shaking their heads. Here, the decision to send him to an asylum is based on obvious distress and danger, delusions, hallucinations, suicidal impulses, murderous rages. These are real and frightening experiences that terrify family and friends. It is important to see that existence. Mental illness is not just a social label. Yet you keep noticing how the same institutions that could shelter the genuinely unwell also swallow people who are simply inconvenient. You peer into a stack of records and find small, strange entries that read almost like jokes written by someone with a dark sense of humor. A few patients are reportedly sent in because of excessive novel reading, study of spiritualism, or overuse of tea. That last one is a quirky little detail that sounds like something your own relatives might have invented just to tease you. Did tea really cause insanity? Or did constant tea drinking simply signal other worries like sleepless nights and anxiety? The record does not explain. It only preserves the phrase like a fossil of misplaced concern. In Anothe, part of town, her father brings his teenage daughter to a doctor, worried about her melancholy ways and refusal to eat. She writes poetry, stares out of the window, and sigh at family dinners. Today, she might be labeled depressed and offered therapy or medication. Here, she risks being categorized as melancholic and unfit for domestic duty. The asylum promises treatment and supervision. It also removes her from the marriage market, which might secretly please a family that does not know what else to do with a girl who will not smile and conform on schedule. Romantic suffering is not cute in this context. It is expensive. You visit a small house where two brothers argue about their eccentric cousin. He insists that invisible forces direct his daily routines and that neighbors are spying on him. His beliefs are bizarre and fixed. He paces through the night, muttering, and has started accusing people of plots. The brothers are torn between love and fear. They decide that confinement might protect him from angry neighbors or police. In situations like this, the asylum becomes a reluctant, last resort, a place chosen because there is nowhere else that can offer any kind of supervision. You feel how complex this decision is. Not pure cruelty, not pure kindness, but are not of both. Then you cross over into the refined world of private patients. In a handsome villa, a wealthy widow argues with her grown children. She's taken up with a younger man, spends lavishly on clothes, and talks about selling property they hope to inherit. They whisper that she is not in her right mind. A sympathetic doctor agrees that her judgment seems impaired. Here, the label of insanity may become a tool that intersects with property law, inheritance, and family strategy. Historians still argue whether cases like this are rare scandals or just the most visible examples of a wider pattern, where MO, nay, and mental health get tangled together. As you drift through these scenes, you feel the pattern forming. The people who end up behind asylum walls are not only those in the grip of terrifying hallucinations or paralyzing despair. They also include the poor who cost too much to support, the loud who refuse to be quiet, the sorrowful who cannot bounce back on command, the rebellious who challenge household authority, and the inconvenient who block someone else's plans. In this world, madness is not just a medical condition tucked away in the brain. It is also a label that sticks to anyone who makes the wrong people uncomfortable at the wrong time, in the wrong place, with the wrong amount of money. You wake to the clatter of keys and the ring of a bell. Long before the sun has fully decided what it wants to do, a voice calls out, brisk and practiced, telling everyone to rise. The dormitory smells of cold air, wool, blankets, and the faint sour edge of too many people sleeping too close together. Your bed is one among dozens, pushed into neat rows so tight that if anyone snores, the sound practically arrives with surround sound. Privacy is not really a thing here unless you count turning your face toward the wall and pretending. You swing your legs to the floor when the attendant tells you to move. The boards are cold under your bare feet, and for a second you think about staying in bed. That experiment ends at the sight of the attendant's expression. Rules live in that look. The day runs on routine, and routine does not wait for one person's sleepy rebellion. Historically, most large Victorian asylums follow strict times, with bells controlling waking, meals, work, and sleep in a pattern that barely changes from one season to the next. It is meant to be calming, a steady rhythm for restless minds. But as you shuffle into line for the washroom, it feels more like bay. NG absorbed into a giant human clock. In the washroom, cold water splashes from metal taps into long stone basins. You wash your face with a shared bar of soap that has seen better days. Mirrors, if there are any, are small and placed high, as if the institution wants you functional, but not too focused on your own reflection. Everyone wears asylum clothing, usually simple and durable. Men might have rough coats and trousers in dark cloth, women plain dresses and aprons. The idea is to strip away the fashions and distinctions of outside life, to make everyone manageable and similar. You glance around and notice how quickly personalities disappear behind identical fabric. Breakfast arrives in a large dining hall, and you sit at wooden tables under the watchful eyes of staff. Bowls of porridge appear, thick and sometimes lumpy, accompanied by bread that tastes like it has inspirational quotes about frugality baked into it. If you are lucky, there is a bit of milk or weak tea. The food is designed to be filling rather than exciting. A lot of patients depend entirely on asylum meals, so quantities matter, but budgets keep flavors simple. You probably will not be posting this breakfast to any glamorous food account, unless your followers are very passionate about beige. As you eat, you listen to the sounds of the hall. Spoons clink, chairs scrape, someone mutters a prayer. Conversation is allowed, but usually kept low. For some patients, being in such a crowd is comforting, a sign that they are not alone. For others, it is overwhelming, a constant buzz that never fades. Historians still argue whether this kind of communal dining encourages social recovery or simply crushes individuality by forcing everyone into the same rhythm at the same tables. You sit quietly and feel both possibilities hovering in the air with the steam from the porridge. After breakfast, the day divides according to sex, diagnosis, and perceived capacity. Men file one way, women another, and different wards peel off to different tasks. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian asylums firmly separate male and female patients, often into different wings or even separate buildings, with staff reinforcing division at all times. You join a ward that is judged calm enough to move freely under supervision. Some people go to the laundry, others to the gardens, others to workshops where they might weave, sew, or repair shoes. Those considered too disturbed remain in days, pacing or rocking in chairs under the constant gaze of attendants. In the day, you feel the weight of hours. Wooden benches line the walls and small groups gather in corners. One man stares out of a window, whispering to someone only he can see. A woman hums the same few notes of a hymn again and again, like a fragile spell against silence. An attendant walks up and down, straightening cushions, reminding people to sit, not lie, unless they are officially resting. On a table lie a few dog-eared books, a deck of cards, maybe some sewing. In theory, this is a place of gentle occupation. In practice, boredom spreads like fog. You realize that if misery wanted a quiet hiding place, this room would do nicely. Sometimes the asylum provides organized entertainments. On certain evenings, there might be a concert with a small band made up of staff and selected patients. You watch as a drum, a fiddle, and a cornet prepare to do battle with the echoing acoustics of the hall. In some institutions, there are even patient choirs, dramatic performances, or dances where pairs move carefully under supervision. A quirky detail from records is that a few asylums field their own cricket teams or brass bands competing or performing outside the walls in front of curious local audiences. Imagine explaining to your friends that why our big Saturday outing was watching the county asylum beat the neighboring town at sports. The rules governing behavior are everywhere, even when nobody is reading them aloud. You learn them by watching. Speak politely. Do not raise your voice without permission. Do not touch others in ways that could be seen as improper. Do not refuse food, even if it turns your stomach. Do not question the timetable. Do not argue with staff, even when they are wrong. Every small rebellion carries consequences. Maybe a stern lecture, maybe loss of privileges, maybe time in a quiet room with the door locked. The asylum presents these rules as necessary for safety, and sometimes they genuinely are. Yet you can feel how easily safety bleeds into control when the same people hold the keys, the medicine, and the power to define what counts as reasonable. Afternoons repeat the pattern of mornings with work, walks, and supervised rest. You might join a line of patients walking the grounds in circles, watched from a distance. The path is deliberate, designed so that nobody can slip away unnoticed. Some people shuffle with their eyes on the ground. Others look up at the sky as if trying to remember what it felt like to be outside without permission. It is exercise, but it is also choreography. You think of it as the slowest and saddest group fitness class in history. Whereas this, where nobody chose the playlist, bath day arrives with its own rituals. You wait in line for your turn. Clothes, folded and placed in labeled piles. Attendants manage the process with brisk efficiency, trying to keep the water hot enough and the schedule tight enough that everyone is washed before the end of the shift. Some patients resist, afraid or ashamed. Others look forward to the rare sensation of full warmth and cleanliness. There are stories of complaints about shared towels, tepid water, and hurried scrubbing. Gee, that feels more like scouring than care. Cleanliness matters to the institution's reputation. So it happens. The quality of the experience depends on the patience of whoever holds the soap. As evening comes, the asylum tries to wrap itself in calm. Lamps are lit, curtains drawn, and patients directed back towards. There might be prayers, Bible readings, or quiet songs, especially in places where religious observance is key to the idea of moral treatment. Some patients find comfort in the familiar words, others simply tune them out too. You settle on your bed, listening to footsteps in the corridor and the distant clank of a gate. Officially, the day is ending. Unofficially, anxious Thoughts and restless bodies are just getting started. Night in the dormitory is its own kind of landscape. Someone sobs under their blanket. Someone calls out in a dream. Someone laughs at a joke that only they can hear. The attendant, on night duty, walks between the beds with a lantern, checking that nobody has wandered or harmed themselves. It is a necessary watchfulness, but it means there is no real darkness, no true solitude. Even sleep belongs partly to the institution. You curl in on yourself and try to imagine what a quiet room with a locked door and no other sounds would feel like. Then realize that even that fantasy is trapped inside the same walls. You drift toward drowsiness, with the routine still ticking in your mind. Wake, wash, eat, work, walk, sit, sleep, repeat. The asylum calls this stability from inside the experience. It borders on a loop that can blur days into one another until you lose track of time altogether. When every moment is watched, scheduled, and measured, it becomes hard to remember who you were before the bell rang and the keys turned. You sit very still as the attendant fingers the leather straps of a straitjacket as casually as someone folding a company. The jacket looks almost ordinary at first glance, just thick canvas with long sleeves. Then you notice the buckles at the back, the extra straps that pull the arms tight across the chest, the way it turns a body into a tidy package. The room smells of soap and sweat and a faint hint of fear that never quite gets scrubbed out of the floorboards. This is not the soft kind of treatment anyone imagines when they hear the word care. The doctor explains that mechanical restraint is only used when necessary. The phrase has a rehearsed feel, like a line spoken in every asylum across the country. In theory, Britain is proud of. A movement called non-restraint, promoted in the mid-9th century by a physician who insists that chains and jackets are unnecessary and well-run institutions. It is a genuine historical shift. Some places ban mechanical restraints almost completely. Others keep them tucked away, like guilty secrets to be dragged out when staff are tired, patients are frantic, and ideals feel very far away. Historians still argue whether non-restraint really spreads humane practice or mainly polishes the reputation of a system that quietly uses other forms of control. You feel the straitjacket being wrapped around you in one of those moments when staff decide your agitation is too much. Arms folded across your chest, hands trapped, far from anything you can grip, you suddenly understand how small a person can feel inside their own skin. The jacket is meant to stop self-harm or attacks on others. It also stops gestures, pointing, hugging, even scratching your own nose. Tiny freedoms disappear in the time it takes to tighten a buckle. Your body becomes easier to move, easier to store, less likely to cause paperwork. Somewhere, an administrator is silently thrilled when the jacket is finally removed. You follow the sound of hinges into a row of side rooms. These are the SE. Seclusion cells, small spaces with heavy doors and minimal furniture. The walls might be padded, the window high and barred. You step inside one and feel how quickly the air changes. In the main ward, life is noisy and crowded. Here, sound is muffled. The door shuts with a final thud that seems to land in your chest. Officially, seclusion is used to calm those in violent excitement. Unofficially, it can also remove anyone who argues too much, weeps too loudly, or simply annoys the wrong attendant on the wrong afternoon. You sit on the low bed, staring at a section of wall that has seen more tears than paint. Time starts to stretch. Minutes feel like hours. There is no clock in here, just your own heartbeat and the scrape of boots if someone walks past outside. A small hatch in the door opens now and then for checks, for food, for a brief flash of light and human expression. Then it closes again. You realize that punishment and treatment lie side by side in this little room, sharing the same lock. One person might call it therapeutic isolation. Another might call it solitary confinement with nicer branding. Water plays a big role in the Asylum toolbox. You walk to a bathing area where a large wooden tub stands ready, filled with cold water that smells faintly of metal. The doctor believes that sudden immersion can shock a disturbed mind back toward balance. Attendants grip your arms and lower you in, ignoring your instinct to resist. Cold clamps around your body like a fist. You try to gasp, but the chill steals your breath. This is the cold bath treatment, recommended for agitation and mania, as if freezing a person can dim their racing thoughts. Elsewhere in the building you see the more luxurious cousin of this method. Continuous baths involve keeping a patient in warm water for hours, sometimes days, with only brief breaks. Nets or canvas covers stop people from imbing out. The goal is to soothe overstimulated nerves, to wrap the mind in liquid quiet. Some patients do relax, lulled by warmth and the rhythm of ripples. Others feel trapped in a giant tepid teacup, watched at all times, pruned like over-soaked fruit. The line between comfort and captivity is as thin as the edge of the tub. High on a wall you notice an odd contraption, a shower that can be turned from gentle to punishing with the twist of a valve. A few asylums install devices that drop sheets of water from above, either as a mild cleansing drizzle or as a powerful blast aimed at shock. One quirky detail from these treatments is the use of timed valves that can be controlled from outside the bathroom, so attendants decide exactly how long the shower rages. You imagine someone inventing a smart shower app for this, and then deleting it very quickly when they realize how creepy it sounds. Drugs arrive in small bottles and powder, packets, lined up neatly in a dispensary that smells of spirits and bitter herbs. Early in the century, doctors lean heavily on purgatives, emetics, and bloodletting, convinced that emptying the body can empty the mind of its storms. Later, sedatives like chloral hydrate, bromides, and paraldehyde become favorites. You swallow a dose and feel the world soften at the edges. Thoughts slow, limbs grow heavy. Staff call it tranquility. You suspect it is closer to chemical silence. A mainstream historical fact is that by the late 19th century, many asylums begin to rely more on sedating medications than on heavy mechanical restraints, claiming progress as they trade straps for spoons. Electrical devices buzz in another room. You watch a patient sit while mild currents are passed through parts of the body based on theories that electricity can stimulate or rebalance nerves. The shock is unpleasant, but not the dramatic jolt of later electroconvulsive therapy. The machine looks like a cross between a scientific instrument and something you would find in a questionable magician's suitcase. Results are inconsistent at best, but the performance of doing something modern and technical matters to doctors, who want to be seen as men of science rather than wardens. In a consultation room, the doctor listens to a woman describe pains in her abdomen, anxiety, and irregular moods. He attributes much of it to her reproductive organs and prescribes treatments aimed at the womb rather than the mind. Massage, P-series, even surgical interventions are framed as ways to cure hysteria, a diagnosis heavily gendered and shaped by cultural discomfort with female bodies and emotions. You watch this with a modern WSEE, fully aware that the boundary between medicine and control over women's sexuality is dangerously blurry here. Historians still argue whether such treatments represent sincere but misguided attempts at help or a more conscious effort to keep women within strict social lines. Back on the ward, you see how staff choose from this menu of options. A restless man shouting about imaginary enemies might be given a sedative, then placed in seclusion. A woman who refuses food could be restrained and force-fed with a tube, the funnel held by steady hands that tell themselves this is mercy. A confused elder who wanders might be fitted with a canvas belt that keeps them anchored to a chair. Each act is justified as protection, protecting the patient from themselves, protecting others from harm, protecting the institution from scandal. Somewhere inside that triangle of protection, the person at the center shrinks. By the time you lie down at night, you carry the imprint of straps on your skin, the chill of water in your bones, and the metallic aftertaste of sedatives on your tongue. The asylum calls these things treatments. Some do bring moments of calm, even relief, especially when fear and hallucinations have become unbearable. Others simply make people quieter, easier to stack, into crowded wards. You stare at the ceiling and feel the questions settle over you like a heavy blanket. In a place where almost every method that soothes can also suppress. How often is care chosen because it heals? And how often because it makes life simpler for the people holding the keys? You open your eyes to the sound of buckets clanking and someone shouting about soap before you can fully remember your own name, as brisk attendant announces that it is time for work. Not a job you applied for, not a job with a paycheck, just the kind of work that arrives with no interview and no option to resign. You sit up and feel that familiar tug of expectation. In this world, idle hands are suspicious. Busy hands are called healthy even when they ache. You are marched with others down a corridor that smells of starch and boiling water. The door to the laundry swings open and a wave of steam hits you in the face. Inside it is a small industrial planet, all heat and motion. Large copper boilers bubble like potion cauldrons, sending up clouds that make the walls sweat. Long wooden tables are stacked with heaps of dirty sheets and uniforms. Somewhere under that mountain lies the shirt you spilled porridge on, now officially part of the landscape. The attendants assign tasks with the efficiency of seasoned managers. Some patients scrub at linen in deep sinks, arms plunged into hot soapy water. Others wring out heavy sheets that twist around their wrists like pale snakes. You're handed a brush and pointed toward a pile of clothing that has clearly seen things. The work is hard, repetitive, and wet. Your fingers shrivel. Your back complains. There is no playlist to make it more fun unless you count the squeak of brushes and the occasional muttered complaint as a kind of minimalist soundtrack. Officially, this is called therapeutic employment. The idea is that steady work gives structure to the mind, distracts from painful thoughts, and teaches habits of order in industry. A mainstream historical fact is that many Victorian asylums proudly advertise their extensive work programs, claiming high percentages of patients engaged in laundry, sewing, farming, and various trades. Administrators write reports about the moral value of labor, as if a good scrub of bed linen might rinse away despair. You can sense some truth in the way rhythm and purpose help people feel less lost. Your muscles slowly fall into a pattern, and the hours pass more quickly than in a chair. At the same time, the economic logic is impossible to ignore. Every sheet washed by patients is a sheet that does not require paid outsideresses. Every uniform mended by nimble fingers is a bill that never appears in the accounts. As the morning goes on, you realize that this laundry is effectively a factory feeding directly into the asylum's budget. The institution saves money, sometimes even produces a surplus of goods to sell. Historians still argue whether patient labor here is primarily about therapy or whether the language of therapy mostly disguises a system built on unpaid work. The truth sits somewhere awkward in the steam, wrinkled and hard to smooth. From the laundry, you drift to a different kind of workplace. Out in the fields behind the main building, a chill breeze replaces the hot, damp air as you step onto the asylum farm. Rows of cabbages, turnips, and potatoes stretch away. Hens cluck in pens. Pigs snuffle in their enclosures, and a few cows stare with the deep, judgmental calm of creatures who know you are definitely overthinking things. Patients move along, the rows with hose and baskets, boots caked in mud. The farm is extensive, almost Ike, a village estate. You watch as a group digs up root vegetables, the soil clinging under their nails. Others carry heavy baskets back to the kitchens. A cart loaded with produce rolls past, pulled by a horse that looks slightly too smug about its central role in operations. In many asylums, farms like this supply most of the institution's food. One quirky detail that turns up in various records is that some of these farms become minor local attractions, winning prizes at agricultural shows for their livestock or produce. Imagine explaining that your award-winning jam was made with fruit grown and picked by people the rest of society considers unfit to live freely. Inside a workshop, the atmosphere shifts again. Sawdust hangs in the air. You Hear the rasp of saws and the rhythmic tap of hammers. Patients build furniture, repair shoes, weave baskets, or spin yarn, depending on the skills available and the needs of the institution. You take a seat at a bench and are shown how to thread and pull in a simple, repetitive motion. Once you get the hang of it, your hands almost move without you. Thoughts drift in and out like quiet visitors. There is something undeniably soothing about creating something solid in a life where so much feels out of your control. Overseeing all this activity are staff members who combine the roles of instructor, supervisor, and foreman. Some genuinely enjoy teaching, correcting your grip gently, praising a neat seam or a well-planed board. Others treat patients like clumsy apprentices whose mistakes personally insult them. Productivity is tracked in ledgers: number of shirts repaired, number of boots resoled, number of chair legs carved. The asylum is not only a place of confinement, it is a small economic engine with patients as the moving parts. During a brief rest, you sit on a low stool and glance around. You notice that those judged in kappa of work are often the most severely ill or physically frail. They sit in side rooms or wander aimlessly under watch. But you also see people who could probably use more rest assigned to heavy tasks simply because they can stand, hold tools, and follow orders. There is no patient union here, no way to negotiate hours or conditions. Being deemed fit for labor is both a compliment and a sentence. Someone might joke quietly that at least you never have to worry about getting fired. In the female wards, the pattern shifts into another register. Women sit in long lines with sewing in their laps, mending institutional clothing, stitching uniforms, or making simple garments that can be sold. Threads tangle, needles prick fingers, and small piles of completed work grow at their feet. This activity is described as teaching domestic skills, preparing women to return to households where they will once again be expected to serve as daughters, wives, or servants. You watch a woman with elegant, practiced hands stitch far more quickly than anyone else. Her background is clearly wealthier, but here the cloth does not care. All stitches count the same. The official philosophy holds that work restores dignity. Doing something useful, the argument goes, helps people remember their place in society as contributors, not burdens. You can see flashes of that. A man holds up a finished chair with shy pride. A woman smiles as she folds a perfectly repaired shirt. Yet you also see what happens when someone grows too tired, when hands shake or eyes glaze. There is little room in the schedule for personal rhythms. The workday serves the institution's needs first. The patient's needs second if there is time. You overhear staff discussing costs. Feeding a large asylum is expensive. Hiring outside workers would be even more so. Using patient labor makes balance sheets look much healthier, especially when local authorities grumble about high rates. Reports sent to boards of guardians and county councils brag about savings achieved through internal production. Somewhere in that math, the value of a human life is measured in loaves of bread baked, pounds of laundry washed, acres of fields tended. You do not see any column that counts exhausted hearts or aching joints. In a quiet corner of the yard, you come across a man leaning on his rake, staring at the sky. An attendant tells him to get back to work. He moves slowly, reluctantly, like someone walking through syrup. Depression weighs him down far more than the tool in his hand. For him, the field is not therapy. It is another pressure he struggles to meet. You sense how difficult it is for a system built on routine to adapt to fluctuating in a weather. Not everyone needs the same dose of labor. Not everyone finds healing in the same tasks. Yet the asylum has one main prescription and uses it widely, like a doctor handing out the same medicine for every complaint. When you finally step away from the day's tasks, hands rough and clothes fleck with dirt or soap, you carry more than physical fatigue. You carry the knowledge that the institution runs in part on the quiet power of unpaid, often unchosen work. In reports and speeches, this labor is wrapped in words like occupation, industry, and cure. From inside the experience, it can feel like a trade you never agreed to. your time and energy in exchange for a place to sleep and a bowl of food with no real say in what happens next. The silence around that bargain is almost as heavy as the buckets in the laundry and the baskets in the fields. You sit on a hard bench in a women's ward and feel the air humming with things nobody says, out loud, around you. Skirts rustle, knitting needles click, and whispers weave in and out of the official silence. The room is full women of different ages and backgrounds, but the labels pinned to them sound eerily similar: hysterical, melancholic, unmanageable, immoral. You can almost see the invisible script hanging on the wall, telling everyone what a proper woman should be. It is a very short script, and it does not allow improvisation. A clerk in a side office copies details into a register. The inked lines show a clear pattern. Many of the women are here after some kind of conflict about behavior at home. One refused to obey her husband. One argued with her employer. One would not stop talking about religion. Another talked too much about politics. A very solid historical fact is that a high proportion of female patients in Victorian asylums are admitted with reasons that mention domestic disobedience, strained marriage, or sexual behavior that scandalized family or neighbors. In a world where women's legal and economic power is limited, calling someone insane can be a very efficient way to shut them down. You turn your attention to one particular woman sitting near the window. Her hair is pinned back with the care of habit, but her posture is tense, her fingers restless in her lap. Her family says she grew flighty, laughed too loudly at dances, flirted with men they did not approve of, and talked openly about wanting to choose her own husband. The doctor who signed her certificate described erotic excitement and moral insanity. You hear those phrases and feel an odd chill. What is being punished is not some mysterious brain disease. It is desire that refuses to stay politely hidden behind a fan. Across the room, another woman rocked slowly in her chair, eyes hollow. Her story is different. After childbirth, she began to hear accusing voices, sank into deep despair, and tried to harm herself. This condition acquires a name in Victorian medicine: puerperal insanity, mental disturbance linked to pregnancy and childbirth. Doctors carefully record these cases, partly because they fit a growing interest in connections between the reproductive body and the mind. The fact that childbirth can trigger overwhelming emotional and mental crisis is real and painful, and you feel sympathy for the physicians who genuinely want to help. At the same time, the idea that almost every intense female emotion can be blamed on womb and ovaries becomes a handy shortcut for avoiding more complicated truths. The ward door opens and a young woman in a plain dress walks in under escort. Her cheeks are flushed with anger rather than illness. You catch fragments of gossip. She worked as a servant, accused her employer of unwanted advances, and refused to keep quiet when nobody believed her. Soon after, she is branded unstable, prone to outbursts, unable to fulfill her duties. It is a strange coincidence how often the word insane appears right after a woman causes trouble for a man with more money and social status. Historians still argue whether such cases are rare extremes or part of a broader pattern where accusations of madness conveniently protect reputations that might otherwise crumble. In a corner, a small group of older women sew quietly while trading stories in low voices. One tells of a cousin admitted because she would not stop attending spiritualist meetings, convinced she could speak with the dead. Another remembers a friend who read sensational novels late into the night, then began quoting dramatic speeches at breakfast. The family doctor confidently blamed the books for inflaming her imagination, warning that too much reading could unhinge a delicate female mind. That fear of brain fever by bookshelf is one of those quirky Victorian anxieties that sounds almost funny until you realize it helps justify locking people up if binge reading could get you committed. Quite a few. Modern bedrooms would qualify as hazardous zones. You visit the office where doctors compile their casebooks. Each entry a capsule explanation of why a woman is here. Phrases like refuses household duties, wanders at night, insists on equality with husband, and exhibits religious mania recur with suspicious frequency. The same behaviors in men sometimes own labels like passionate, troubled, or eccentric. In women, they more often become symptoms. A husband who drinks and shouts may be called weak or sinful. A wife who shouts back may find herself described as deranged. It is as if the diagnostic system carries a quiet filter that amplifies female deviation into evidence of disorder. In another room set aside for interviews, a doctor listens to a young wife who's been brought in by her in-laws. She complains of endless housework, sleepless nights, with children, and a husband who spends money on drink while scolding her for being nervous. The doctor notes her tearfulness, her talkiveness, and her unreasonable expectations. He pays less attention to the condition she describes and more to the fact that she dares to complain. Treatment plans mention rest, calm, and a return to obedience. What is missing is any real change in the situation that made her collapse. It is a mental health philosophy that prescribes adaptation to unfairness rather than questioning the unfairness itself. You move along to the part of the institution reserved for women labeled particularly troublesome here. The atmosphere feels tighter. These patients have fought attendance, broken rules, refused to sit quietly. Some have ripped clothing, shouted insults, or tried to escape. Restraints and seclusion are more common. One woman paces the length of the room, muttering about courts and lawyers. She insists that her commit was illegal, that she signed nothing, that she wants to bring a case. Staff roll their eyes and call her delusional, yet part of you wonders what would happen if anyone properly investigated her story. In a system where men control legal decisions and medical judgments, a woman insisting on her rights can look unsettlingly like a symptom. Further along, you find patients who have been here for years, their original crisis long blurred by the slow erosion of institutional life. A widow who once ran a small business now spends her days folding and refolding napkins. Her admission notes mention business anxiety and improper friendships with men. It is never entirely clear whether she suffered a genuine breakdown under pressure or whether her independence threatened relatives eager to manage her property. You feel how easily financial motives, family tension, and genuine illness can tangle into a knot that nobody bothers to separate once the door locks. Religious language floats constantly in the background. Chaplain preach sermons about patience, humility, and acceptance. For women, these virtues are praised with special emphasis. A patient who submits quietly to rules, prays, and keeps busy at needlework is described in reports as improving. Another who questions, argues just, or refuses to take part in devotions is marked as resistant, even when her mind is clear and her objections make perfect sense. Obedience and sanity start to look suspiciously similar on the page. The ideal recovered woman is calm, modest, and grateful, ready to slip back into domestic life without making a fuss. You overhear a rare conversation among senior staff about numbers. They notice that women and men fill the wards in almost equal proportions, sometimes with women slightly outnumbering men in certain institutions. This is not inevitable in a society where men dominate public spaces more visibly. It suggests that the net-catching female deviation is very fine. A daughter who will not marry. A wife who insists on leaving a cruel husband. Even a spinster aunt who keeps adopting stray cats and spending her small income on causes instead of family. All risk being pulled toward that net whenever their behavior embarrasses the wrong person. Later, you find yourself sitting beside a patient who quietly explains that she never felt strange until everyone began telling her she was strange. For years, she tried to fit into expectations that felt like tight shoes. When she finally kicked those shoes off, laughed too loudly, loved too boldly, or refused to swallow insults, the label arrived. Listening to her, you begin to see how madness can sometimes grow out of the stress of constant self-suppression, and how an asylum can become both a refuge from pressure and the harshest form of it. As night settles, the ward quiets, women lie in rows of beds, some still silently crying, some staring at the ceiling, some already snoring with gentle, unglamorous honesty. The institution sees a room of patients whose disturbed minds must be calmed so they can return to proper womanly roles. From the inside, it feels more complicated. This is also a room full of stories where desire, anger, grief, and longing collided head-on with rules about femininity that left very little room to breathe. You walk through a pair of tall iron gates and feel the ground tilt, slightly under your feet. Not because the earth moves, but because the rules change the moment you step inside. Outside, money buys comfort, privacy, and respectable explanations. Inside, especially on the pauper wards, money or the lack of it, quietly decides almost everything about your daily life. You start in a crowded receiving room, sitting on a hard bench with a group of new arrivals. Their clothes are worn, boots cracked, hands rough from work that never paid enough to keep hunger away. These are parish cases. People certified insane who cannot afford private treatment. Local authorities send them here because the workhouse has no idea what to do with someone who screams at shadows or refuses to speak for days. The asylum is not just a medical institution, it is also a storage space for the poor who become inconvenient. An official stands at a desk sorting papers into two neat piles. One pile is marked with the word pauper, the other with private or sometimes paying. It is a simple division, but it shapes everything from where you sleep to how much attention your doctor gives you. A very solid historical fact is that Victorian asylums usually separate paying patients from paupers, sometimes in different wings, sometimes just in more comfortable wards with better furniture and quieter halls. You can almost hear glass creaking in the floorboards. You walk first into a pauper ward. The room is long with rows of plain wooden beds pushed close together. Mattresses sag from years of use. Blankets are thin. The plaster on the ceiling peels in small moons. There is no decoration beyond a few religious texts and maybe a faded picture nailed high on the wall. Patients crowd the space, some pacing, some sitting on benches, some huddled by the fire, craving warmth more than conversation. When people talk about overcrowding, they are thinking of rooms like this, where bodies and worries press together with no real escape. Then, escorted by a senior attendant, you cross a corridor into a private ward. The change is immediate. The air smells less of sweat and more of polish. Beds are fewer and spaced further apart. Some even have curtains for a hint of privacy. Personal possessions sit on small tables, maybe a Bible, a comb, a framed photograph. A fireplace burns more steadily here and the windows are cleaner. Patients wear clothes that fit better. Sometimes their own garment. NTS instead of standard uniforms. The same building, the same diagnosis, but an entirely different mood. Like switching from budget seating to a quiet corner of a lounge. In the private wing, you listen to a doctor speaking gently to a middle-class patient. They discuss worries about business, grief over a lost child, fear of failing in public. The doctor shows patients, asks questions, and notes small changes in mood. Recovery here does not only mean calming symptoms, it also means preparing someone to reclaim a respectable place in society, to step back into roles where they manage shops, offices, or comfortable homes. There is a sense that their mind is an investment worth protecting, a valuable engine that simply needs a tune-up. Back on the poor side, the tone shifts. Doctors still make rounds, but appointments are shorter and more hurried. Case notes for these patients often run to brief phrases written quickly in cramped handwriting, summarizing entire lives in a few dismissive words. Chronic, demented, dirty habits, no hope of recovery. These labels land heavily when the person attached to them has almost nothing in the way of outside resources or influential relatives. Historians still argue whether this difference in attention is driven mainly by prejudice against the poor or by the sheer weight of numbers that make detailed care almost impossible. You follow the supply chain that feeds the institution. Local ratepayers stare at columns of numbers, calculating how much each poorer lunatic costs the parish per week. If the asylum fee rises, Arguments flare. Officials search for ways to keep numbers down, sometimes delaying commit, sometimes pushing for discharge, even when someone is clearly not ready to cope outside. For the poor, madness comes with a price tag that entire villages feel, and that can make compassion a fragile luxury. It is easier to be understood. Ding. When the bill does not land directly on your doorstep. In the day room of a pauper ward, you sit beside a man who once worked in a factory. Years of noise, dust and exhaustion wore him down. When he finally broke, shouting at unseen enemies and refusing to return to the machines, his employer found it simpler to let him go. Without savings or strong family support, his path narrowed quickly. Workhouse, then asylum. Now he spent his days playing with a piece of string, eyes distant. No one talks about rehabilitation into a skilled position. If he ever leaves, it will likely be to casual labor, if any at all, or back to parish relief. You walk into a small sitting room reserved for private patients and hear Gentile conversations about novels, letters from home, and plans for sea air once discharged. Here, the expectation of return is strong. Families can afford convalescence in resorts, quiet rest in country houses, and gradual reintegration into gentle routines. You realize that recovery is not only about what happens inside the asylum, it is about what waits outside. A person stepping back into grinding poverty has a much steeper hill to climb than someone landing in a cushioned drawing room with servants to handle the noise of daily life. In a ward for chronic pauper cases, you notice how age, illness, and poverty mingle. Elderly men and women who might once have lived out their final years with children or grandchildren instead lie in narrow beds because their families are too poor or too scattered to take them in. Their minds are fading, their bodies frail. The asylum doubles as a grim version of an old age home for those who cannot pay for anything better. They are not here because anyone expects dramatic improvement. They are here because there was nowhere else to go when confusion and frailty tipped into danger. You learn of funerals held from the asylum Shah. Pell, where pauper patients are buried in simple graves with wooden markers or unmarked plots. Attendance is sparse. Sometimes just a chaplain, a few staff, and whatever patients are deemed calm enough to walk to the cemetery. Names fade quickly from memory without headstones that families can visit or maintain. One odd little detail from institutional life is the way some asylums keep neat maps of burial grounds, recording rows of numbers instead of full memorials. In death, class still speaks quietly. Private patients are more likely to be taken home for burial, remembered in churchyards with carved stone and flowers. Paupers rest in lines that only written plans remember. In conversations with staff, you catch hints of their own class tensions. Many attendants come from working-class backgrounds and know all too well how close they themselves might be to hardship and instability. Some feel a rough solidarity with poorer patients, softening their tone, bending rules when they can. Others distance themselves sharply, perhaps out of fear of seeing their own reflection in the people they guard. Private patients, with their politeness and educated accents, can be easier to treat with professional courtesy, especially when their families offer tips or grateful gifts. You picture the city outside the walls with its cramped courts and smoky alleys. There people battle daily with high rents, low wages, and unpredictable food prices. A few nights of bad sleep, a lost job, a death in the family, and a mind can stumble under the strain. Without networks of wealth and influence, these stumbles have far less room to recover quietly. The parish notices disruptive behavior quickly when it spills into streets and tenement yards. The asylum becomes the catch basin beneath a leaking roof of social problems that nobody wants to repair properly. By the time you sit on a bench in the asylum, listening to the wind tug at the hedges, you have seen how class shapes every pore of this place. Who gets a curtain around their bed, who gets time with a doctor, who listens, who is written off as incurable, who is expected to return to useful work, and who is quietly parked until death. The building calls everyone patients, but the experience of being Mad in the system feels very different if you arrive with a trunk, letters of introduction, and a bank account, or if you arrive with only a parish label pinned to your coat and the lingering smell of the workhouse in your clothes. You stand at the edge of a gravel yard and notice something that makes your chest tighten. Among the shuffling adults in uniform coats and dresses, there are smaller figures. At first you think they are just very slight grown-ups worn down by illness. Then one turns their head and you see it clearly. A child maybe 12, hair too long, eyes too big, sleeves rolled up because nobody bothered to find a jacket that fits. This place is built for adults, but the walls do not care who walks through the gates. You follow that child inside. The corridor seems even larger, beside a small body. Doors loom, hinges squeak, and the smell of soap, old food, and disinfectant wraps around you like a heavy coat. The ward you enter is officially for weak-minded and epileptic cases, a phrase that Victorians use for people with learning disabilities or seizure disorders. A very concrete, historical fact is that many county asylums in Britain keep children and teenagers alongside adults before dedicated institutions and special schools for idiots and imbecile appear later in the century. To planners, a mind that does not match the standard is simply tagged and filed under the same heading no matter the age attached to it. You sit on a low stool near a boy who rocks gently back and forth, humming tunelessly. His hands twist in his lap, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He glances up at you briefly, then returns to his own little rhythm. Around him adults pace, mutter, and occasionally cry out. There are no toys, no bright pictures, no school books. The only decorations are notices on the wall written in tidy script that he probably cannot read. Childhood here does not come with chalkboards and playgrounds. It comes with discipline, schedules, and a constant low thrum of adult distress. In another corner, you notice a girl, folding and unfolding a piece of paper that used to be a letter from home. The writing has smudged with handling and tears. She mouths the words as if memorizing them to keep them safe in her head. She's not much older than 14. Her record says moral defect and incorrigible behavior. The family could not manage her. The workhouse would not keep her, and the asylum has space. You do not need much imagination to fill in the possibilities. Running away, refusing to work, stealing small things, maybe answering back to the wrong adult once too often. In a world with few options, the path from troublesome child to certified patient can be alarmingly short. You follow a warder as he leads a small group of the younger inmates to a yard for exercise. Their steps scuff the ground, shoes too big or too worn to fit properly. Out here, for a moment, it almost looks like a school break. One boy skips in crooked circles, another tries to start a game of tag only to be told to settle down. A girl crouches by the wall, tracing patterns in the dust with her fingertip. There is no swing, no ball, no choked hopscotch squares, just flat ground and watchful eyes. You want to hand them a heap of toys and a permission slip for noise. The doctor, responsible for this ward, carries a notebook filled with observations. He writes about a boy who cannot speak, a girl with repeat D seizures, another who does not learn letters despite repeated attempts. He notes which children can feed and dress themselves and which need constant help. In clinical language, he classifies their abilities and limitations. Historians still argue whether such assessments mark a step toward recognizing special educational needs or whether they simply justify long-term confinement by labeling young lives as permanently flawed. You can feel the way those written words might follow a child forever, closing doors before they even know what might have been behind them. In the dining hall, the children sit at the ends of table, squeezed in among adults. Bowls of porridge and bread arrive. An attendant reminds everyone to eat neatly. You watch a boy of 10 try to copy the way an older man holds his spoon, careful, measured, hoping not to be shouted at. It is like watching someone learn table manners on fast forward, motivated more by fear than etiquette. A girl in a patch dress slips across into her pocket. A small insurance policy against hunger later. Nobody notices. When the meal is over, the adults file away, leaving smaller, legs scrambling to keep up. Education exists only in fragments. In some asylums, a sympathetic chaplain or nurse gathers children and mildly affected adults for simple lessons in reading, writing, or religious instruction. You see a room with a few slates, chalk, and a stack of well-used primers. A blackboard leans against the wall, listing letters of the alphabet in faded strokes. For an hour, the atmosphere shifts. A child traces shapes, tongue stuck out with concentration. Another proudly recites a line from a hymn. It is easy to imagine what a real school tailored for them might be like. Then the bell rings and they are ushered back into adult routines, as if learning were a pleasant hobby rather than a rite. A curious little detail hides in way some staff talk. A few attendants call the youngsters their pets or babies, fussing over them with rough affection, sneaking them scraps of extra food or a moment of play. Others see them simply as smaller patients, just as likely to be scolded or punished as any grown person who steps out of line. There are stories of tiny straitjackets and miniature restraint chairs being used when a child is judged too wild or dangerous. The idea of such equipment sized for young bodies sits in your imagination like a stone dropped into still water, sending slow, sick ripples outward. You listen to how children end up here. Some have been simple since birth, never fully understanding the world around them. Some suffered fevers, head injuries, or convulsions that left lasting damage. Others experienced trauma that adults did not know how to name. A child who saw a parent die violently or who endured abuse might withdraw or explode in ways that frighten guardians. In communities without skilled support, the options feel limited. When families plead for help, authorities choose the institution they already know, even if its walls were never meant to hold growing minds. In the infirmary, you see an epileptic boy lie recovering after another seizure. His limbs twitch occasionally, his breathing slowly evens. The staff are used to this. They roll him gently onto his side, tuck blankets around him, and move on. Epilepsy frightens many Victorians who sometimes consider it a form of insanity or a mark of degeneracy. A child with frequent fits can be shunned at school, feared by playmates and avoided by frightened relatives. The asylum promises supervision and safety, yet the price of that promise is life in a place where every role model is another patient, another overwhelmed adult, or a harried attendant. One afternoon, a visiting inspector pauses by the children's warden, Frau NS. He notes the lack of age-appropriate facilities, the mingling with chronic adult cases, the absence of structured schooling. In his report, he suggests that special arrangements should be made for young inmates. These suggestions feed into a broader movement that eventually promotes separate institutions and training colonies for children with intellectual disabilities. Those places bring their own mix of care and control, hope and hardship. But standing here in the echoing ward, you can feel why reformers begin to argue that children at least deserve something different from this. When evening comes, the children climb into beds that are only slightly smaller than the ones beside them. Tiny shoes sit neatly underneath. A doll made from scraps of cloth rests under one pillow. The closest thing to comfort a girl can keep in a room full of watchful adults. Lamps dim, footsteps recede along the corridor, and whispers die away. The building settles into its usual uneasy sleep. You lie on one of those narrow mattresses, listening to the small sounds around you. A child sniffles softly. Another talks in their dreams, calling out for a mother, a brother, a dog. The institution sees them as units in a ledger, cases in a register, souls to be watched. What you hear is something simpler and hard to bear. Young voices trying to grow inside a world that never remembered to make space for them. You stand at the edge of the ward in a plain uniform, keys hanging at your side, and, for the first time, you're not the patient here. You are staff. The room feels different from this angle. Instead of seeing walls closing in, you see tasks piling up, beds to make, meals to supervise, tempers to watch, forms to fill. The bell rings, and it sounds less like a gentle routine and more like a timer in a game that never lets you pause. You have not even had your tea yet, and already 3 p.m. Opal want your attention for 3 entirely different reasons. Your day starts earlier than most of the patients in the staff quarters, which look suspiciously like slightly upgraded cells. You pull on your uniform and check that your shoes are clean. Some institutions insist that attendants and nurses present themselves as models of order with polished buttons and tidy hair. Because appearance is supposed to inspire respect, the pay for all this is underwhelming. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian asylum attendants and nurses are usually paid less than skilled workers in trades like printing or engineering, even though their jobs involve night shifts, heavy lifting, and dealing with crises that would make a factory foreman run for the exit. Down in the ward, you join the handover from the night shift. Reports fly past you. Who slept? Who shouted? Who tried to climb out of bed? Who refused medication? The night attendant looks hollow-eyed, face pale in the gaslight. He has spent hours walking between beds, listening for trouble. You can tell he is counting the minutes until he can finally lie down in his own bunk. For him, the institution is both workplace and almost home, a building he rarely leaves, except for short breaks. It is not unusual for staff to live on site or in cottages on the grounds, their entire social world wrapped in the same brick and mortar that holds the patients. As you help rouse the ward, you start to understand how thin the line is between calm and chaos. One man refuses to get up, another insists he is the rightful king and demands a crown before breakfast. A woman begs you not to let anyone come near her, shaking so hard the bed rattles. You have roughly 30 seconds for each of them if you want to stay on schedule. Your training, if you got any formal training at all, probably lasted only a few weeks. Many attendants pick up their skills on the job, watching older staff and hoping they copied the right parts. Historians still argue whether the low standards of training were a tragic oversight or a deliberate cost-saving choice by managers who preferred cheap, easily replaceable workers. In the middle of all this, you also have your supervisors. The medical superintendent expects the wards to run like well-oiled machines. Matrons and senior attendants patrol with sharp. If a patient looks dirty, it reflects badly on you. If someone escapes, your name appears in angry reports. Yet, these same authorities may scold you for spending too much time with a single distressed person when there are floors to scrub and records to complete. It is a management style that could be summarized as do everything, do it perfectly, and do not ask for more staff. You start to see why cynicism grows as fast as dust in the corners. On a rare break, you slip into the staff room, a cramped space with a table, a kettle, and chairs that have seen better upholstery. Here, attendants drop their official faces for a few minutes. Jokes bounce back and forth, some dark enough to surprise you the first time you hear them. Humor becomes a pressure valve. Someone imitates a pompous inspector. Someone else mimics a patient in a way that makes you uneasy. The laughter is real, but so is the bitterness. Underneath, a quirky little detail from many asylum records is the popularity of staff dances and sports clubs with cricket matches, choirs, and even annual balls meant to boost morale. You imagine those evenings as moments when uniforms blur and everyone desperately tries to remember they're more than their job title. Back on the ward, you watch how different personalities handle stress. One nurse speaks gently, using pet names, smoothing blankets and tempers, with the same careful hands. Patients trust her, reach for her when they are frightened. Another attendant relies on strictness, barking orders, keeping everyone moving through the day like a drill sergeant with a mop. In some cases, that authority prevents fights. In others, it provokes them. When tempers flare, the room can turn dangerous in seconds. A thrown plate, a sudden punch, a chair kicked over. You know that you're expected to step in physically if necessary without any of the protective gear or backup that modern staff might have. You notice the toll this takes on bodies and minds, lifting patients, restraining those who thrash, dragging heavy tubs, standing for hours on hard floors. All of it leaves joints aching and back stiff. Headaches bloom after long shifts filled with constant noise. Sleep comes fitfully, often interrupted by memories of someone screaming or a nagging sense that you forgot to lock a door. There are stories of attendants who start drinking heavily, using alcohol to numb the edges of exhaustion. Discipline boards occasionally reprimand staff for arriving on duty smelling of spirits. The institution punishes the symptom while quietly depending on the same people to show up again tomorrow. You enter the office where incident reports are written, when a patient is injured, when a restraint is applied, when seclusion is used. Someone has to describe what happened in neat handwriting. The language here is polite and controlled. Patient became excited. Necessary force was employed. No undue harshness was observed. You can sense how much can be smoothed away inside those phrases. A slap becomes a firm corrective. A shove turns into guiding the patient back to bed. Historians still argue whether the worst abuses were rare eruptions by brutal individuals or systemic outcomes of overcrowding, fear, and permanent understaffing. Reading between the lines, you suspect that both are true at once. Not all staff are indifferent. You meet a junior doctor who spent extra time listening to patients, scribbling detailed notes, advocating for better conditions. He argues with administrators about overcrowding, tries new approaches, experiments with talking, therapies, or recreational activities. For his efforts, he gains a few grateful patients and a reputation among colleagues as idealistic, maybe even naive. Some of these medical men will later publish treatises calling for reform, describing in restrained prose the misery they witnessed. Others will simply move on to more prestigious posts, leaving the heavy daily lifting to attendants who never get to write books. You watch a new attendant on his first day, face still smooth with hope. He treats everyone with patience, apologizes when he has to be firm, and looks genuinely horrified when an older colleague roughly shoves a patient back onto a bench. Weeks later, you see his temper snap during a frantic moment. Voice raised, grip too tight. The older colleague claps him on the shoulder and says, "You are learning." That sentence echoes in your mind. In a setting where aggression is sometimes the fastest way to impose order, kindness can start to feel like a luxury nobody can afford for long. As evening approaches, you help settle the ward for the night. Blankets are straightened, windows latched, lamps dimmed. Patients mutter prayers, curses, or nonsense. You lock the medicine cabinet with a small metallic click that sounds far louder than it should. Finally, you step into the corridor, shoulders drooping, and tomorrow will repeat many of the same tasks, the same conflicts, the same uneasy compromises between compassion and control. You are part of a system that relies on your labor and blames you when things go wrong, that asks you to be both nurse and guard, comforter and enforcer. It is easy to focus only on the suffering of those in beds and cells. But here, walking away with your key, ring heavy at your side, you understand that the house of misery traps its staff as well, tightening around them one exhausting shift at a time. You are standing at a busy Victorian newsstand, the kind with headlines shouting louder than the vendors. Ink is still damp on the papers and every sheet seems to vibrate with outrage. A man beside you mutters shocking revelations at a lunatic asylum, and you realize the quiet world hidden behind those high walls has just burst onto the front page. You buy a paper and start reading. The language is dramatic, all about wretched inmates and brutal keepers. It tells the story of a patient who died after being left in a cold isolation cell, or of another found with bruises that no one can explain. A very solid historical fact is that Victorian Britain sees several major asylum scandals exposed in newspapers and parliamentary inquiries with names of institutions dragged into public debate like dirty laundry flapping in the wind. You follow the print back to its source. Inside a cramped working-class house, a family argues in anxious whispers. Their relative died in an asylum, and the official explanation feels thin. Pneumonia, exhaustion, heart failure, all wrapped in careful phrases. The bruises on the body do not quite fit the story. A brother insists on asking questions. A mother quietly fears they will be punished for making trouble. You can feel how hard it is for ordinary people to confront professionals armed with certificates and titles. An inquest is called. You slip into the back of a chilly room where a coroner, jurors, doctors, and staff gather. The dead patient's body has already been buried, but testimonies bring the final days to life in painful fragments. An attendant describes a restless episode. A doctor talks about necessary restraint. Another staff member hesitates, then admits that sometimes people are left unattended longer than they should be. Historians still argue whether such inquests genuinely uncover the truth or mainly produce just enough scandal management to calm public nerves. From the asylum side, you hear a very different tone. Administrators insist that a few unfortunate incidents are being exaggerated. They point to clean wards, tidy statistics, kind letters from grateful families. They remind everyone that caring for disturbed minds is difficult and dangerous, that injuries happen even with the best intentions. Some genuinely believe this. Others know that every confirmed case of abuse threatens funding, reputation, and careers. Closing ranks starts to feel almost automatic, like a reflex. You wander into the corridors after dark when gossip runs freer. Nurses and attendants share stories in low voices. A patient who was beaten by a frustrated staff member and told to keep quiet. A woman who reported an assault only to find herself labeled delusional. A man who went missing for hours and was later found locked in a disused storeroom, shivering and confused. None of this appears in official records. The building has its own whisper network, carried in murmurs and raised eyebrows. Sometimes, though, whispers escape. A dismissed attendant, outraged at what they saw, might write a letter to a local paper or contact reformers. A former patient with enough education and determination might publish a memoir describing their treatment in vivid detail. One quirky detail from this culture of exposure is the small genre of first-person escaped lunatic narratives that find eager readers, half scandal lovers and half reform-minded. You picture Victorian commuters reading these on trains the way people now scroll through threads about workplace horror stories. You sit in a drawing room where a middle-class family reads one such account aloud. Shocked exclamations fill the space between sentences. Someone suggests donating to a reform society. Someone else comments that the author must be exaggerating. After all, doctors are gentlemen. Are they not? The room divides along these lines. Those who think the system is rotten at the core and those who believe only a few bad apples spoil an otherwise noble enterprise. You notice that people's opinions line up pretty neatly with how much they trust their own social circle of professionals. Reform societies gather in rented halls lit by gas lamps. You watch as speakers describe overcrowded wards, inadequate food and routine use of harsh restraints. They call for stricter inspections, better training, and independent oversight that does not rely solely on reports written by the people being inspected. Pamphlets fly out into the world, filled with earnest paragraphs and occasional slightly unhinged typography. Some of these groups are careful and fact-driven. Others lean into emotional language that can make them easy targets for critics who accuse them of hysteria. Back at the asylum, staff feel the ripples. A new rule appears. No one is to talk to journalists without permission. Letters from patients are scrutinized more closely. Complaints are gently discouraged or firmly shut down. When inspectors arrive, they're guided along selected routes. Fresh flowers appear in visiting rooms, and the most compliant patients are invited to sit in, view, knitting, or reading like wholesome advertisements for institutional life. Behind closed doors, the same old problems remain. The performance is for outside eyes. You watch an inspector who decides not to play along. Instead of staying in the superintendent's company, he wanders off to talk privately with attendants and patients. He lifts blankets, examines bruises, asks about food, tests locks. He notices the difference between the official account and the smell of the place. His report, written in measured bureaucratic language, quietly condemns what he has seen. Not every visit is like this, but when one is, you can see how the tiniest wedge of independent scrutiny can pry open a space for change. The press has its own motives. A sensational story sells papers, so editors eagerly publish tales of cruelty, neglect, and horror. The cartoonists get to work drawing wild-eyed inmates and monstrous keepers. Some readers feel righteous anger and push for reform. Others simply enjoy the thrill of being frightened at a safe distance. Historians still argue whether press coverage did more to improve conditions or to reinforce stereotypes, that people with mental illness are helpless victims or terrifying villains. Either way, the image of the asylum as a shadowy house of misery lodges itself in the public imagination. In taverns and parlors, ordinary people trade stories that may or may not be true. A cousin who went in for mild melancholy and came out broken. A neighbor who threatened his wife with the line, "I can have you sent away if you keep this up." A whispered rumor about a doctor who keeps dangerous secrets in the basement. Even wild exaggerations leave a residue of fear. If stepping out of line might land someone behind those walls, then staying quiet starts to look safer than speaking honestly about distress. You return to the newsstand at the end of the day. Fresh editions arrive with new headlines, sometimes about asylum, sometimes about wars, elections, scandals involving money rather than misery. Public attention shifts quickly. Inside the institutions, though, the echo of every exposed scandal lingers. Staff know they might be watched. Administrators adjust their reports. Reformers collect stories to push for change. Families weigh the risk of trust against the fear of betrayal. Standing there with ink on your fingers, you realize that the story of these places is never just about bricks, routines, and treatments. It is also about who gets to tell the truth, who gets believed, and how much discomfort society is willing to feel before it demands something better. The whisper network, amplified now and then by an outraged headline, keeps reminding everyone that behind the walls, far from public view, suffering never stays silent forever. You slip into a crowded lecture hall that smells of damp coats and restless opinions. Gas lamps flicker, casting halos around the heads of doctors, clergymen, and journalists, crammed onto wooden benches. At the front, a speaker clears his throat. He is a physician with tired eyes and a reputation for pushing his luck with authority. He has spent years inside asylums, and tonight he is here to say uncomfortable things about what he has seen. In a voice just loud enough to carry to the newspapers, he describes wards where restraints are locked away, not proudly displayed. One well-known historical example is a doctor named John Connolly at Hanwell Asylum, who in the 1840s promotes a policy of non-restraint, arguing that locks, kindness, and careful supervision can replace chains and jackets entirely. You picture him pacing a corridor, insisting that patients are not wild animals. Some colleagues applaud, others mutter that he is naive. You can feel how radical his ideas seem in a world that still believes fear is the quickest route to obedience. After the lecture, you follow a different figure through a rain-swept street. She's a determined woman in a plain dress, carrying a notebook that has seen too many cold, damp evenings. This is Dorothea Dix, an American reformer who travels in Britain as well, visiting asylums and prisons, collecting details of neglect and misery, then presenting them to governments with relentless energy. She has no official power, no keys, no title, only stubbornness and an ability to make politicians feel uneasy in their comfortable chairs. It is a surprisingly effective combination. You trail behind her on an inspection visit. She walks into a ward with a direct gaze that makes staff stand her. She asks questions about food, clothing, bedding, and exercise, and she does not seem interested in polite evasions. When told that a patient is beyond help, she walks to the bed herself, speaks softly to the person lying there, and writes something in her notebook. That small act, acknowledging Priya's NCE rather than just a number, feels almost revolutionary in a place built on classification. You can sense that she will carry these impressions straight into a report that might embarrass more than one official. Journalists play their own role in this uneasy army of reformers. You lean over the shoulder of a young reporter as he sits in a smoky cafe, scribbling furiously in a notebook stained with coffee. He has bribed an attendant for stories, glanced at admission registers, and slipped into Sunday visiting hours pretending to be a cousin of someone's cousin. Now he is crafting an article about a particular asylum where deaths rarely match the cheerful language of annual reports. He tones down his most outrageous sentences so the editor will print them, but the core is still sharp enough to sting. Reform does not come only from famous names and printed columns in a church hall decorated with mismatched evergreens and paper garlands. You watch a group of respectable ladies organize a charity concert for the relief of the insane poor. The program includes hymns, sentimental songs, and a gentleman who insists on reciting tragic poetry for far too long. A quirky detail in gatherings like this is the habit of serving themed refreshments, such as lunacy teas with biscuits stamped with tiny mottos about compassion. It is all terribly earnest, slightly absurd. And yet, by the end of the night, enough coins clink into the collection box to pay for extra blankets or improved food in a bleak ward. In a cramped parlor, a father dips his pen and writes to the commissioners in lunacy, describing bruises on his son's arms and the smell of decay in the ward where he lies. He rewrites sentences until they are polite but firm, hoping that respectfulness will make someone take him seriously. Families like his send hundreds of such letters, some ignored, some prompting surprise insp. Actions. You can almost feel each envelope as a physical push against the solid door of institutional secrecy. Small but persistent, you find a thin volume in a second-hand bookshop, a memoir by someone who once lived behind high walls. The cover is plain, the title modest, but the content is electric. The author describes humiliation, boredom, rare kindnesses, and the slow grinding of hope. They write about staring through barred windows at fields, wondering whether anyone outside remembers they exist. They also write about other patients, giving them names and quirks instead of diagnosis. That simple act, turning cases back into characters, is itself a quiet rebellion against the cold categories of medical reports. In a tea room above a shop, a small group of former patients meets under the respectable cover of a literary circle. Once the door is closed, they share stories that never made it into official notes. One recites a poem about a window that never opens. Another tells a funny anecdote about swapping name tags to confuse a pompous inspector. Laughter bubbles up, edged with sadness but still real. You watch them reclaim their experiences with their own language, not the terminology stamped on their certificates. It is a fragile kind of power, yet it exists. You listen to a young doctor arguing with his colleagues in a hospital committee room. He wants separate, smaller homes for convalescent patients, more occupational therapy by choice rather than compulsion, and mechanisms that allow complaints to be heard without punishing the complainer. His seniors smile tightly and talk about budgets and discipline. Historians still argue whether such internal reformers managed to change the core of the system, or mainly encouraged a more polished, bureaucratic version of the same old control. You can see that incremental change feels frustratingly slow when measured a guy. NST, a single human lifetime. In another building, a clergyman preaches that the insane are still souls worthy of care, not just burdens. He visits wards with a small choir, sings hymns, and frowns when he sees patients with no shoes or ragged blankets. He writes to the local paper, framing better treatment as a Christian duty rather than a fashionable cause. For some audiences, that language carries more weight than medical arguments. Reform arrives in many dialects: science, religion, economics, and simple shame. Occasionally, you witness outright resistance from inside the walls. A group of inmates refuses to line up for a particularly disliked attendant, staying seated on benches until someone in authority comes to ask why. One man smuggles a note out in a loaf of bread sent back to his family, describing punishments and naming specific staff. A woman deliberately behaves with exaggerated calm during every doctor's visit, hiding her anger so she can secure discharge, then plans to talk publicly about her time inside. These acts are small, risky, and often invisible in official histories. Yet they show that people in asylums are not simply passive victims. They think, plan, and push back when they can. As night falls, you sit at a desk lit by one unsteady lamp, watching petitions, letters, articles, and pamphlets pile up. None of them swings a magic hammer that shatters the whole structure. The buildings still stand, the keys still turn. Yet every account, every protest, every quietly furious paragraph adds another crack. You can sense a slow, grinding shift in the air, as if the idea that Medusas are unchallengeable is losing its grip. Somewhere between the polished speeches of doctors, the relentless lobbying of campaigners, and the raw voices of survivors, a different vision of care begins to take shape, fragile and uneven, but real enough that sleep comes a little easier to those who dare to imagine it. You arrive at the gates of a familiar-looking institution and feel something subtly different in the air. The walls are the same height, the bricks as solid as ever, but the mood is not quite as heavy. A new sign has been added above the entrance using fresher language. Instead of lunatic asylum, where it now reads County Mental Hospital, the letters are carefully painted as if a fresh name alone could lighten the place. You step through and notice that though the old routines persist, small cracks are starting to show in the structure of misery. In the superintendent's office, a doctor leaves through a thick new law book. He mutters about regulations, voluntary admissions, and new categories. By the early 20th century, some legislation in Britain and elsewhere begins to allow people to enter psychiatric hospitals without being certified as insane in the old legal sense. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Mental Treatment Act of 1930 in England and Wales, for example, introduces the idea of voluntary patients and outpatient clinics. Even though the culture of compulsion remains strong, you watch the doctor weigh up these new ideas. On the one hand, they offer a path that does not involve stamp certificates and magistrates. On the other, they threaten to blur the tidy line between sane and insane that his whole career has been built upon. You wander toward a ward where an open-door policy is being trialed. The heavy locks are still there, but some doors stand ajar, watched but not bolted. Patients walk in and out, onto verandas and airing courts with more freedom than before. Staff keep a weary eye on those who wander near the boundary. Yet there is less rattling of keys, fewer clanging bolts. The theory is that trust can calm minds more effectively than iron and constant suspicion. Historians still argue whether these experiments genuinely change daily life for most inmates, or whether they remained confined to a few showpiece institutions used to impress visitors and critics. On a sunny afternoon, you join a group of patients in a so-called villa ward on the hospital grounds. Instead of one massive block, some newer layouts include smaller detached houses meant to feel more home-like. In the villa kitchen, patients peel potatoes, prepare tea, and set tables with mismatched but real plates. There is even a cat sleeping on a chair, looking deeply unimpressed by the grand experiment. Life here mimics the domestic routines of the outside world, a practice meant to prepare people for discharge. You can feel how different it is to drink tea from a china cup rather than an institutional mug, even if the tea still tastes stubbornly weak. In a small consulting room, you watch a younger doctor sit down across from a patient and ask a surprising question. Instead of focusing only on symptoms and discipline, he inquires about feelings, childhood memories, worries about work, and fears about the future. Ideas from new psychological movements drift into the hospital, some inspired by early psychoanalytic thinking, others by a broader interest in talking cures. Conversations become, at least in some corners, part of treatment rather than a distraction from it. The patient hesitates, then begins to speak, slowly, reclaiming experiences that were once dismissed with a label and a sedative. You stroll past a newly furnished occupational therapy room, where shelves hold paints, clay, weaving frames, and musical instruments. Under the guidance of a cheerful instructor, patients try sketching, modeling, or playing simple tunes, unlike the compulsory labor in fields, and this activity is more about expression than productivity. A man paints a crooked but vivid landscape. A woman shapes a clay bird with delicate fingers. Finished pieces are sometimes displayed in small exhibitions for visitors. A quiet announcement that minds considered damaged can still create beauty. One quirky detail that emerges from this era is the production of picture postcards showing asylum gardens, villas, and bandstands. Sometimes featuring art by patients themselves, these cards get sold in local shops and sent through the post, turning hospitals into strangely picturesque tourist images in the administrative block. Numbers on charts hint at shifting patterns. Some people now come in for shorter stays, treated for what are called nervous illnesses or war neurosis after brutal conflict sends soldiers home with shattered sleep and trembling hands. The idea that mental disturbance can arise from trauma rather than inherent weakness gains ground. Shell-shocked veterans arrive with haunted eyes, and doctors experiment with rest, talking therapies, and gentle routines instead of permanent confinement. You sense that the boundary between respectable patient and lifelong inmate is wobbling, at least for those whose suffering carries the badge of military sacrifice. Outside the main gates, new institutions appear: small host, after-air homes, and charitable boarding, houses where convalescent patients can live under lighter supervision. You walk through one such house where a handful of residents share chores and prepare simple meals. They are technically discharged, but they have not completely left the hospital's orbit. Letters and visits connect them back to the main institution. The arrangement offers a halfway space between the rigid wards and the full chaos of city streets. Whether it feels like freedom or just a slightly larger cage depends very much on the person you ask. At a public meeting in a town hall, you listen to mental hygiene campaigners speak about prevention. They argue that cramped housing, overwork, alcohol, and untreated physical illness all strain minds to breaking point. Their solution is not only better hospitals, but better societies, cleaner streets, healthier workplaces, more parks and education. About emotions. For a moment you feel a rush of optimism if people can accept that mental health is a shared responsibility. Maybe fewer crises will reach the asylum gates. Yet, you also hear another darker thread in some speeches about protecting the stock and separating those labeled feeble-minded from the breeding population. Hope and harm travel together, sharing the same platform. You sit in a consultation room where a social worker meets with a family considering admission for a relative. Instead of marching straight to certificates, she discusses alternatives, outpatient visits, temporary rest homes, arrangements with charitable societies. A shift toward community care is beginning in slow, uneven steps. The idea that every troubled mind must be removed from sight for years is no longer unquestioned. You see the family grapple with choices, torn between relief at these new options and fear that anything less than hospital care might be judged neglectful if something goes wrong. You notice, however, that for many chronic patients, the so-called reforms barely brush their daily lives. They still wake to bells, eat simple institutional meals, follow strict schedules, and sleep in long wards. New therapies and policies often focus on those judged curable or promising. The old, the severely disabled, and the long-term residents remain in the same beds, under the same ceilings, watching new fashions in medicine come and go like seasons they never fully feel. The hospital can present an image of progress while much of its population remains stuck in place. In the superintendent's office, discussions about costs never really stop. Building, NG villas, training staff, and funding after hour all require money that local authorities hesitate to provide. Debates about whether to invest in modernization or simply maintain minimal standards rage quietly in committee rooms. You watch a group of officials decide that painting walls and improving food will satisfy inspectors more cheaply than hiring new nurses or reducing patient numbers. On paper, the hospital improves. In practice, the ratio of carers to cared for barely shifts. As you step out into the hospital grounds, evening light settles over lawns and trees planted decades earlier. Paths curve more gracefully. Now, seats are placed with an eye to comfort, and some patients stroll without constant supervision. A band plays a soft tune on a small stage, notes drifting up to windows where others listen from inside. The scene is almost peaceful, yet you can still feel the weight of locked doors just out of sight. The presence of endless case, books filled with names that never leave. Change has begun, but it is partial, patchy, and often reserved for those whose stories fit new ideas of treatable illness and respectable suffering. You walk toward the gate, boots crunching on gravel, aware that the house of misery is learning to speak a gentler language. It calls itself a hospital now, paints fresher signs, experiments with talking cures, open doors, and art rooms. Some lives inside, these walls genuinely improve. Others remain trapped in old patterns, only lightly dusted with modern vocabulary. Progress and stagnation walk side by side, sharing the same corridors, each step forward matched by a stubborn patch of floor that refuses to move. You sit on a plastic chair in a bright waiting room that smells of hand gel and vending, machine coffee. Fluorescent lights buzz faintly overhead. A television on the wall cycles through health advice, weather and news. This is not a Victorian asylum, but you feel a faint echo anyway. Security cameras watch quietly from the corners. You hold a clipboard with forms that ask about your mood, your sleep, your appetite, and whether you've ever thought of ending your life. The questions are more precise than anything on a 19th century certificate, but the sensation of being measured is still familiar. A nurse calls your name and smiles, guiding you along a corridor washed in pastel paint. Doors lead to consulting rooms, a crisis suite, offices full of screens. You pass a poster that says, "It is okay not to be okay," with a stock photo of someone staring thoughtfully at a sunrise. The language is softer than the phrases once used about lunatics and moral defectives. Public campaigns encourage people to talk about depression and anxiety, to seek help early, to treat mental health like any other part of the body. That shift is real and powerful. A mainstream historical fact is that from the later 20th century onward, many countries formally closed their large, long-stay asylums and replaced them with psychiatric units in general hospitals and community-based services. You enter a small room with comfortable chairs and a box of tissues carefully placed on a low table. A psychiatrist or psychologist sits opposite you, laptop open instead of a leather case book. They ask about your history, your family, your work, and your fears, not just your symptoms. You talk about burnout, social media overload, relationship stress, or the feeling that the world is constantly on fire. The conversation feels different from anything a Victorian doctor might have had. Yet in the back of your mind, a small voice still worries about being judged, labeled, or quietly filed under awkward. Medication has changed the landscape entirely. In a consultation, you discuss antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, sedati, VES, each with its own list of possible effects and side effects. A very concrete fact of modern psychiatry is that the introduction of drugs like chloromazine in the 1950s helped spur deinstitutionalization. Because symptoms that once kept people in hospital for years can sometimes be controlled enough to allow them to live in the community. You swallow a pill with water and feel none of the crude violence of cold baths and restraint chairs, yet you still know that medicine can be used to soothe or to silence depending on who holds the prescription pad. Historians still argue whether the move from mechanical restraint to chemical control represented liberation, or simply a more discreet way of encouraging compliance. You step into a modern inpatient unit. The doors buzz, open electronically instead of clanking, but they still lock. Bedrooms hold fewer beds, often just one, with windows that let in natural light. There are posters on the walls, maybe a whiteboard listing the day's group activities. Patients walk in sweatshirts and jeans, chatting with staff who wear lanyards, not key, rings as heavy as small weapons. Ward rounds involve multidisciplinary teams: doctors, nurses, social workers, occupational therapists. You hear talk of care plans, risk assessments, and recovery models. The vocabulary is new, and so are many of the intentions, but the question remains familiar. How much of this setup is genuinely about support, and how much about keeping distress out of public view? In a therapy group, you sit in a circle while people share stories of panic attacks, psychosis, trauma, and addiction. No one calls anyone mad. The focus is on coping skills, grounding techniques, breathing exercises, and learning to spot early warning signs. You practice naming feelings instead of hiding them. You learn about cognitive distortions and unhelpful thought patterns. It is a long way from moral treatment sermons about sin and self-control. At the same time, you may still hear comments about being a burden or costing the health system money. Very old anxieties put on new suits outside institutional walls. Community care surrounds you in ways you might not always see. There are crisis teams that visit people at home, peer support groups in church halls, helplines answered in the small hours, school counselors, workplace well-being programs, mindfulness apps on your phone, cheerfully reminding you to drink water and breathe. This web of support has grown over decades, threaded through welfare states, charities, and voluntary organizations. It aims to prevent the kind of lifetime confinement once considered normal. Yet gaps remain. Some people fall straight through and land on streets, in shelters, or in prisons that now hold many individuals who would once have been patients. You notice a curious trend when you walk around many cities. Grand old asylum buildings have been converted into flats, hotels, or shopping centers. One quirky detail of modern redevelopment is the marketing language used for these places. Brochures describe them as heritage, estates with character, high ceilings and peaceful grounds. The names are softened into something like the Laurels or Parkside Village. Only old photographs or faint ghost stories hint at what life inside once felt like. You might stroll through a courtyard where people once marched in supervised circles, holding a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, checking messages under trees planted to soothe entirely different anxieties. Stigma has shifted shape rather than disappearing. You might feel able to tell friends about seeing a therapist for anxiety, but less comfortable discussing a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Employers publicly support mental health awareness days, yet quietly judge long absences or fluctuating performance. Social media can be a lifeline for sharing experiences, but it can also turn suffering into content with strangers, rating and reacting to deeply personal stories. Historians still argue whether modern visibility has truly reduced discrimination or whether it often flattens complex experiences into slogans and hashtags. You imagine the voices of those who lived through older systems standing beside you in a clinic or scrolling through support forums. Some would be astonished at the range of treatments, the respect for consent, the idea that patients can participate in decisions. Others might point out that long waits for help, rushed appointments, underfunded services, and the use of involuntary commitment in crisis are not so distant from earlier forms of control. The conversation between past and present would be messy, hopeful, and uncomfortable all at once. Standing on a bridge at night, phone in your pocket, you think about how fragile minds are and how much they carry. War, poverty, discrimination, climate fear, loneliness, and information overload press on people in ways that would confuse a Victorian observer. Yet, the core human needs are familiar: safety, understanding, dignity, companionship, and a place in the world that does not depend on perfect composure. Modern mental health care is an ongoing negotiation between those needs and the structures built to respond to them. You take a slow breath and picture a future in which support is easier to find, where early help is the rule rather than the exception, where people are not sorted into worthy and unworthy based on income, gender, or how neatly their symptoms fit familiar patterns. No system can erase all suffering. Minds will always have their storms, But as you turn away from the clinic, stepping out into streets lit by electric glow and phone screens, you carry the knowledge that every story told, every policy questioned, every act of ordinary kindness nudges the world a little further from cruelty. That knowledge rests in your chest like a small, steady light, enough to guide you through the dark for one more night. You lie back now, letting the images drift gently away, like mist lifting from an early morning field. Brick walls soften in your mind, iron gates fade, and even the busy glow of modern waiting rooms grows dimmer. What remains is a quieter understanding that people everywhere have always struggled with their own thoughts and feelings, and that the urge to help and the fear of what we do not understand have always lived side by side. Your breathing slows and you picture a calm place of your own, choosing. Maybe it is a small garden at dusk with warm air and the soft rustle of leaves. Maybe it is a quiet room with curtains drawn, a fan humming gently, and the faint glow of a bedside lamp. In that place, you're not being measured or judged or asked to fill in forms. You're simply there, allowed to rest, allowed to exist without explaining anything. If any part of this journey felt heavy, you can set it down now, like a book you close and place on a shelf. The stories stay where they are. You do not have to carry them into your dreams. You can keep only the gentle parts. The reminder that kindness matters, that listening matters, that small acts of care can soften hard edges in any time and any system. As your eyes grow heavier, imagine a soft blanket of quiet, settling over you, tucking in your thoughts, smoothing out the sharp corners of the day outside your window. The world can keep spinning busy and loud in here for these next hours. Nothing is demanded of you. No bells, no keys, no appointments. Just the slow rhythm of your own breath. Steady and deep asleep comes to meet you like an old friend who knows Daish. E-way in the dark. End of script. Sweet dreams.